This special meeting of the Board of Education for January 5th, 2021. Oh, could everybody mute, please? I'm hearing an echo and it makes me a little crazier than normal. For tonight's let's see. For tonight's meeting, any item that will be voted on has been posted on the PPS website under the board and meeting tabs. This meeting is being streamed live on PPS TV Services website and on Channel 28 and will be replayed throughout the next 2 weeks. Please check the district website for replay times. Happy New Year, everyone, and welcome to tonight's special board meeting. Director DePass, as chair of the School Improvement Bond Committee, would you like to introduce our first item tonight?
Had to unmute there. I'd be delighted. So this item is the appointment of the Bond Accountability Committee members as part of the 2012, 2017, and 2020 bond programs. So the Bond Accountability Committee, as we often refer to as the BAC, had 9 members, with 3 having left the committee at the end of 2020, just last week. With the departure of those BAC members, coupled with the passage of the 2020 bond, there's an opportunity to maintain the strong capital management expertise on the committee as a whole, while increasing the breadth of professional experience and backgrounds on the BAC and the committee's demographic diversity. Earlier this year, I worked with staff to co-create a BAC application form to increase diversity on the committee, both demographic diversity and diversity of experience. Board members, current BAC members, and PPS staff reached out to the community and their networks. Specific efforts were made to reach out to underrepresented communities and to potential applicants with experience in one or more of the 2020 bond scopes of work. As a result, we received 14 strong applications for consideration. All applicant data, including demographic information and professional experience, was provided for review to the School Improvement Bond Committee members, but applicant names were removed to ensure the selection process was focused solely on increasing demographic diversity and breadth of experience on the Bond Accountability Committee. Based on the applicant responses and staff recommendation at the December 10, 2020 School Improvement Bond Committee, we recommend that the Board of Education consider the following appointees for membership to the Bond Accountability Committee: Kenichi Oyugusu, Kara Snow, Angela Jarvis Holland, and Darren Golden. And I want to highlight how we increase the diversity of this committee, because I think it provides a model for us moving forward and recruiting for other committees, volunteer committees. So first, we created an application process which asked respondents to voluntarily provide demographic information, their age, their race, their gender identities, in addition to their professional backgrounds and interest in serving. Then we shared out widely, and we asked others to share out the call for volunteers to expand the reach. Staff did their best to use a values-based approach in the selection of the new BAC members, specifically our race and social justice values, to round out the committee's current depth of knowledge and experience. And I'm really proud to share that as a result of this process, we now have the opportunity to add 3 women, 2 African-American members, 3 people under 40. And we're in turn recommending a disability rights advocate, someone with expertise in the minority women contracting space, a technology expert, and someone finally who attended PPS and is a veteran and a civil rights advocate. Finally, before we leave, I'd like to say a few words of appreciation for our outgoing bond committee chair, Kevin Spellman. For 8 years, Kevin has generously offered his time and energy to support the PPS bond and community. Kevin was one of the original members of the BAC dating back to January of 2013 and has chaired the committee for the entire duration of the bond program. His tenure has seen numerous changes in both bond management and PPS leadership, and his steady hand has provided a consistent voice for the board and the Portland community. He has gone above and beyond in volunteering his time in other district efforts, including participating in the development of the original long-range facilities plan and numerous other PPS activities. Kevin has always been just a phone call away to staff and board members alike, and has provided guidance on a wide range of topics over the years. And he doesn't know this, but if he's listening, I have volunteered him without his knowledge to continue to be available by phone to the incoming newly appointed BAC members who might benefit by his experience. We are grateful to Kevin for taking on this endeavor and for chairing a high-functioning team that has provided expert and uncompromising advice to the board. I hope you'll join me, the rest of the board, the superintendent, and staff in thanking Kevin Spellman for his many years of service. Kevin, you've changed us, and we are grateful for your service to the district. And finally, I'd like to say a big thank you to staff for the collaboration we experienced during this process. It was really a pleasure to work with Dan Jung and Marina Cresswell on this process.
Sorry, I have to find my unmute button too. Thank you, Director DePass, and thank you, Kevin Spellman, for your service, and to all of our new members of the BAC, thank you for your willingness to serve in this capacity. Do I have a motion and second to adopt Resolution 6221, the appointment of Bond Accountability Committee members?
So moved.
Second.
Second.
Okay, so I heard Director Brim Edwards move and Director Constam just beat out Director Scott for the second. Is there any board discussion on this resolution?
I just want to note, I'm just really excited for this new slate of candidates. I think the process that Director DePass created to do this was really great. We had amazingly strong candidates and really excited for these new folks to join the BAC.
I agree, and I hope that we can lean on this model for populating some of our other citizen committees, some of our other community member committees, because we had a number of other really great qualified candidates that would have made us exceed our number that we need for the committee who were willing to serve. So good job bringing forward people who are interested in serving in this volunteer capacity.
I will note that when we sent letters to the people that didn't make it, that we absolutely said, please be in touch with the board office. We don't want to let 10 strong candidates get away from us. So I have reached out to them, thanking them for applying and asking them to stay engaged.
Excellent.
I want to just join Director DePass's comments about Kevin Spellman's tenure, because having viewed or participated in many of those meetings, the level of detail and the amount of preparation that the committee members and the chair take, and the care for taxpayers' dollars, and really trying to sort of maximize our resources to the benefit of our students. It is, they've given us a gift of their time and their expertise, and especially when we relaunched sort of our bond program after decades of not having a bond, it was really important, the foundation that was laid. So thank you to Kevin and your leadership. And I really want to applaud the effort that went into creating adding diversity to the committee. We had talked about this as a board, but to translate what we talked about and our desires to have a more diverse board, I think sometimes that doesn't always happen, although even if everybody wishes it is going to happen. So thank you, Michelle, for your leadership and getting us to this point, because I think the district will benefit from having varied viewpoints and experiences on the committee.
Ms. Bradshaw, is there any public comment on this matter?
There's not.
Okay. Any further board discussion? The board will now vote on Resolution 6221, appointment of Bond Accountability Committee members. All in favor, please indicate by saying yes.
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 All opposed, please indicate by saying no. Are there any abstentions? Resolution 6221 is approved by a vote of 7-0, with Student Representative Shu voting
yes.
Thank you, Nathaniel. All right, very excited about this new chapter in our BAC and very grateful for all the work the members have done in the years leading up to now. What a beautiful foundation we have to build on. All right, we are now continuing talking about beautiful foundations to build on as we look at our goals for the 21-22 budget. We'll be adopting a goal for the unending fund balance reserve. We first began to discuss this item on December 1st, and we felt like we didn't have enough time to talk about it. So we had some briefings with Claire in our weekly check-ins. And then again, we had a dedicated work session on December 15th. This is a new thing that we're doing a different way because this is considered best practice for school districts to develop budget principles and policies to formalize standards and fundamental values that should govern our budgeting process. It is recommended that staff develop long-term revenue and expenditure forecasts, typically covering 5 years as part of the budget process, and to consider these forecasts during budget development in order to address the district's future financial position. The PPS school, the Portland Public Schools 5-year financial forecast prepared for the board includes a staff recommendation to maintain an 8% general fund reserve over the next 5 years. This forecast will be updated each fall in preparation for the budget process. Superintendent Guerrero, did you want to say something about the recommendation ahead of us tonight?
Only that I've appreciated directors spending a bit of time in really understanding all the different ways that we can set a roadmap for our fund balance in particular, since that's a priority, making sure our school district has reserves. And it's really sort of a conversation around our comfort level, the priorities and the circumstances that we're finding ourselves in. And as staff commences the budget development process, which started in earnest all afternoon and was very inclusive of a cross-section of people who work in the school district, including many school leaders whose perspective we appreciate. It's important for the staff to know how big is the pie that we have to work with. And so I think that the discussions that the board has had is, informing, sort of what that looks like for us moving forward, knowing that we can't only be thinking about the coming year, but have to think about the subsequent years. So we're being responsible and can take that into consideration with our planning, especially as we sequence a whole lot of priorities. And we know current circumstances include dealing with this pandemic, which has put us in a very different trajectory, not just in our focus and in our work. It's had such a impact on the economy. And it's, there's been a lot of deltas in sort of our funding streams, and that also includes some supplementary ones to help address some of these issues. But as we continue our march towards realizing our community-defined vision, and we work at continuing to develop, and we look forward to sharing, in a couple of months where we are with our multi-year strategic planning. We also know we have some immediate priorities like the educational recovery that is in front of us, because we know students have been impacted by the loss of direct in-person instruction the last 10 months. So we want to be able to sort of build back some of that time, some of those supports and interventions, and likely that includes quite a bit of expanded summer programming options. But I think tonight's decision helps to begin to define, what we have to work with. And it'll be important to sort of be clear about where the gaps are and where we need to put in those additional supports. So at the same time that we want to keep all of our other multitude of work strands moving forward. We have big desires and goals and objectives for curriculum, for professional learning, for human capital, for workforce diversity, and of course, all of our ongoing construction projects that we're also excited about. So I know Deputy Superintendent Hertz has now presented a couple of times and made some iterations to some of the paths forward for the board's consideration. So unless Claire, you want to have something to add here, that's my 2 cents for the moment.
The only thing that I would add is that since we started this process, there's been a federal stimulus package that has come forward and been approved, and we are expecting in March about $29 million that will help us with a one-time source of funds to support that. One of the things the board was concerned about was how are we supporting student learning in terms of summer schools and interventions as they return from being out of, in the same room with the teacher. So that's great news. And we're going to be looking closely at that and making sure that we're not setting it up with permanent staffing when the funding source is not permanent, but really looking at how can we utilize those funds in a one-time expense that will help achieve the goals that the board has expressed in supporting our student learning.
Thank you both. So what we're going to do is we are going to make a motion to bring forward this resolution as written in our board materials, which would be going with scenario 4 in the memo, which is the 8% fund balance. So we'll make a motion, get that on the table before us, and then we can robustly discuss that amount and that measure and make amendments as we see so fit. We'll also hear some public comment, and then we will vote on whatever then is before us in the resolution. Okay, so we're gonna kick off the conversation. Do I have a motion and second to adopt resolution 6222, which is adopt a 21-22 budget goal for ending fund balance reserve?
So moved.
Do I have a second?
Second.
All right, so Director Constam moves and Director Moore seconds the adoption of resolution 6222. Is there any board discussion? I would really like us to consider, sorry, Scott, I'll get to you once I say my little bit. I still am a scenario 3 kind of girl, going down to a 7% fund balance. Again, I think that taking the cut to fund, we're going to have to cut funding next year anyway, but I think taking the bigger hit in year 2 instead of year 1, just with the amount of learning loss that students will have coming into us. I know that we have had stimulus passed. We are hoping for more money, but I still think that I'd rather see the cut in year 2 than in year 1. So that's why I would encourage us going to the 7% ending fund balance. Scott?
First, I want to ask, so 29 million we're expecting. What is that earmarked for? So
we haven't made a proposal for all of it yet. There will be some for feeding children. We've been feeding children for almost a year now, and we anticipate all children having free meals and throughout the district. So we anticipate that to last for 18 to 24 months. So there will most likely be a need for supporting the nutrition services program that can't run into a deficit mode. And then as well, I would ask Superintendent Guerrero to speak to more of the instructional side of the long-term impacts of not being in school with our students and how we might use those funds to support student learning.
Right, which is what they're intended for, is to help supplement district's ability to confront this pandemic. And so regardless of some of the limited in-person or hybrid or reentry models we contemplate, all of them will have costs and staffing and extended time and materials. So some of that we would hope to resource from those sources of monies to support that kind of activity for our students.
And Claire, what's the difference between the 29 million that you're citing and the 33 million that was referenced in our materials?
So the 33 million is the total, but there is money that goes to charter schools and goes to, there's multiple pieces. So this would be direct into our neighborhood schools at PPS.
And does that include an assumption of full reimbursement of the FEMA monies, some of which we've already spent?
Not at this point. The FEMA money, we have not assumed receiving any yet. And I think that there are questions. The rules have changed. They gave us a set of rules. We submitted, then they changed the rules. And now it's not clear what's going to happen. And this has been a nationwide conversation. So it's still an ongoing conversation about whether we'll receive FEMA or not.
So as we look at the cuts that are in scenario 4, it looks like it would be 26 million cut over the 5 years, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And so that 29, does that all need to be spent in year 1, or is that money that we can spread out across those 5 years to make up for some of the shortfalls?
It's not meant to be spent over 5 years. There will be, because it's federal funding and they have a fiscal year end that ends in September 30th. So while it's coming in March, it will carry forward into the next year for the full year, all the way to September. And then I haven't read the rules on how much carryover we'd be able to have at that point. But that would get us through the 2 summer programs for sure that we're intending to spend.
So that would make scenario 4 a little more attractive because we would have resources to sort of soften the shortfall in year 1.
Mm-hmm.
And then we would also have extra resources for summer programs. Okay.
So can
Other discussion? Go ahead, Rita.
Yeah, can I follow up on that? So as I recall, the last time we got some federal assistance, it amounted to about 9 million, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Is that
8.6, yeah, I think, yeah.
okay? And I'm assuming that we have spent all of that at this point.
Yes.
So here, I guess here's my question. It seems to me that 29 million in the larger scheme of things is not a whole lot of money. So it's not like a windfall. So it may cover the additional costs, but I'm assuming that we're not going to have a whole lot left over. There's not going to be a lot of wiggle room. Is that fair?
So our costs continue to change with what our circumstances are. And so, for instance, as you know, the governor has issued new rules and new metrics. We're still working through what that all means to us. So in terms, so yes, we have money set aside to prepare for hybrid instruction. And so we got that included, but in terms of knowing, there's still a lot of unknowns. So having some of the 29 million set aside for the unknowns is a healthy thing to do.
So this may be the same question, but asked differently. How much of that money do you think would be, again, we've got sort of the table that you've laid out with the different options and the 5-year period has different, that's basically operating expenses as usual.
It's general fund, yes, operating. Mm-hmm.
And doesn't account for the additional costs if we were in some kind of hybrid model for some period. Is that correct?
So this year is a mixed bag. For 2021, there are things that we're not spending and there's things that we're having to spend. So really right now it's coming out pretty close to a wash on what we're needing, what we have gone unspent versus what needs to be spent. Right. So for instance, all the things that we needed to prepare classrooms, we've spent, but we've also saved on not turning on the 50,000 computers every day. Right. So there's offsets in the budget this year that continue to evolve and we continue to monitor. And you're about to, later this month, actually beginning of February, you'll receive an updated quarterly report to give you a sense of what's happening with both the revenue that we're receiving at the state school fund, because enrollment is down across the state, not just us. So that helps us when it's across the state. So there'll be revenue shifts and there will also be expenditure shifts. But right now, with our current scenario, it's running up to date, we're running about even with just by moving things from unspent to things that we need to spend on by moving money around.
Okay, so I'm just trying to gauge, and you may, and it's very fair to say you have no idea because there's so many moving parts. Of that 29 million, how much of that could be applied to that operating deficit, as opposed to it's being applied to deal with higher costs? Some of it's going to nutrition services.
So we have enough expense. If our goal is to increase the general fund balance to carry it forward into the next year, we have enough expense to do that in general fund that would be that eligible by that stimulus dollars. To me, it doesn't matter, as we know that we're going to have increased costs next year in terms of opening schools. So whether we're spending it out of general fund or the one-time fund from federal source, at this point does not really make a difference. We know that we have both pots available to us, and we will continue to use them to our best ability, and really continuing one-time expenses to be paid for by the grant funding, so we don't end up putting permanent staffing in a temporary source. So that's our main thinking about how it gets spent out.
No, I mean, I understand that. But what I'm trying to figure out is, at the end of the day, if we have extra expenses, which I think is probably likely if we're in a hybrid situation for all sorts of reasons, and we're providing free meals for all students, are we still effectively cutting $12 million from our basic ongoing model?
That's our current scenario, because in general fund, we do need to make a current service level adjustment in our general fund, because we will have a shortfall there. And we can't replace it with one-time money. We really have to have a long-term adjustment for that. And whether it happens in year one or year two is certainly something the board can consider.
So Director Bailey, certainly
Yeah.
there, as last spring, we'll certainly be thinking about what short-term measures we can put in place to preserve resources in this second semester. And these are one-time monies, and we will want to use them to support our students, and staff's on deck here if we need them. It's really premature to be able to calculate what are going to be the employee costs of some of these models, but there will be a cost. We have our regional soup on there who could probably tell you to run a summer school, it's going to take about this much staffing and resources. And if we want to expand on that, that's going to take a chunk of change too. And then there'll be some educational material costs too. But we'll try to preserve what we can between now and the close of the budget year to draw down that gap that we have. See where there's opportunity to finish closing that out. That was actually part of the exercise that staff engaged in today, is to see what we can do about that general fund gap now.
So I'll make my speech now. I won't support the resolution. We are facing huge needs for our kids. I think multi-year interventions will be necessary to help them catch up. And if we're cutting 12 million, that's not gonna get us going in the right direction. I think we need more resources in that, and the more we bring into year one will save us money down the line. Because if we only move the needle this far in year one, and we still have this much to make up with a fair number of our kids, that's going to be more expensive in year two and year three going forward. It's just going to be a huge shift. So my preference is to put as much money as we can into next year, which means spending down our reserves more.
Director Bailey, would you like to make an amendment to the resolution before us at this point, or would you like to let there be further board discussion? Or are you happy to just vote no?
I don't have the spreadsheet in front of me with the formulas to come up with something responsible, because again, as we've seen, it's not just a 1 year fix, a 1 year change carries into the next 4 years as well. And I appreciate staff. And that's what's great about this process. We have to think long term. And I really want to, again, thank staff for bringing this long term process to us. It's what we need to do. So I don't know how to, I don't have the numbers to say this is what the plan should look like, but I would say shifting down reserves, and again, doing that away in that 5 year projection so that we don't get huge bumps and jumps along the way. I don't know how to put that into a resolution. Okay. Except in very general terms, in terms of board guidance, to say, spend more reserves, make this as smooth as you can going forward, but we need to spend big in that year one to make up that deficit as much as possible.
Okay. Director Brim-Edwards, it looked like you were going to say something, and then Director Constam, I saw you just unmuted. So
let me just, if I may just ask Director Bailey a question. So Scott, is there another one of the scenarios in front of us that you prefer or recommend, or are you talking about something completely different?
Give me a second to answer that. So why don't you go ahead and I'll jump back in a bit.
Great. So I had a number of questions. As I mentioned when we had the previous board discussion about this, I'm struggling with the not knowing the size of the loss and the amount of acceleration that needs to happen, and to be making a decision based on the reserves without knowing that other piece of information. So my first question ties into that, and this is for the superintendent or whoever. It's the learning side of things. When do we predict that we will have some sense of the either the learning loss or the amount of learning that needs to take place or be accelerated over the next year? And I asked that just because I'm thinking about where we might be in the budget process to sort of understand how we might be able to calibrate or flex during the budget process.
Well, what I'd say is it's an unusual year, and we've had this conversation. It also probably won't surprise anybody to learn that after the inauguration on the 20th, probably the first thing states will do is request ESSA waivers. And so summative assessments, SBACs, probably won't be taking place, which are hard to do if you're not in school or if you're just back in school to set aside 2-3 weeks to take those tests. So when it comes to having a measurable sort of indicator, which I think is what your question is, Director Brim-Edwards, so we can actually have an informed conversation, we want to have some kind of a dipstick or snapshot of how we're doing. We know there's going to be an impact of out of necessity of the model that we're implementing now. We've suggested that the MAP assessment at the end of the semester would be an important way to get an idea about where to steer supports and interventions. We're hopeful that that's something we'll be able to implement. Usually that's open for a couple of weeks, the window, and takes a little bit of time. And we think we might be able to pull it off remotely. And after a couple of weeks of crunching that data, I know Dr. Brown is here and he's testing me here, could probably have something to you, at the end of February. But Dr. Brown, what do you think? To the question of having an indicator of how our students did sort of across the school system to help inform our investment decisions, do you want to elaborate on that?
Sure. I think I share the concern about the lack of standardized data to be able to make an informed decision over time. And yeah, things certainly have changed a lot in a very short window of time. When we started this academic year, I think there were a lot of questions about whether or not an assessment could be performed remotely and whether or not the data would be reliable or valid across the system as a whole. And early research by NWA across the country has indicated that in grades 3 through 8, they didn't see a substantial difference in the reliability or validity of the assessments performed remotely, again, in grades 3 through 8. So I think that, as the superintendent has outlined, that an end of semester assessment would be a wonderful opportunity for us to gather data and to begin to move through that fairly quickly to be able to anchor some of our thinking about how to prioritize things moving forward. And probably more importantly, an opportunity for our parents to understand where their students currently stand and begin to think about the recovery process for our students as we move forward.
Great. So just to summarize, so if we had that into semester data, that could inform the just the budget process that the board and staff will go through this spring. Okay, great. And then I had a more technical question about the estimates for Deputy Superintendent Hertz. One of the variables is the local option. And in this scenario, we have the local option is projected at 3%, while the overall historical average is 9%. And I'm just curious about that because the local option is a property tax, which, despite everything else going on around us, property taxes are not, and property values are not going down, and there's actually been more development. So I'm curious why we have it, or is that just a standard plug number that you put in, or is there some reason that I'm missing that would not be more true to or more aligned with the historical? I can see if it was income tax or something that was dependent upon the economy, but that's not the case with the property tax.
The most recent history is 3%. And so I'd have to go back into the report. The local option levy is the difference between the real market value and the assessed value, and two different tax rates from Measure 5 and 47. And it's not just a regular assessed value like you do for a bond. It's a calculation, right? And so what I can say is that when we look at our local option levy in the historically, when we had great growth in housing costs, and the real market value was going up at a real steep rate, that's when we saw the really high percentage growth in local option levy. And so it's not growing well. In the last 2 years, this projected for this year and for last year, based on our real property collections, we're seeing more of a 3% growth rate rather than the higher rate. And so we're being conservative right now because of our most recent experience.
Okay, great, thank you. And then I think the other question is just, I'm looking at the package that we had on page 16, there's a table. And just to understand sort of the nomenclature we're using, when I look at this, it looks like from 2017 to 2021, we have $110 million increase in resources to the district, if I'm reading that correctly.
Excuse me just for a moment. I don't have the same page numbers as you. Could you tell me what report you're reading?
The 5-year financial forecast.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you. I've got that.
Okay, it's the last page in the packet.
Thank you.
It shows between 2017 and the 2021 forecast that we've had 110 million, would have a $110 million increase in our overall resources. And that my assumption is that's not including the potential one-time federal dollars.
Yeah, this report was created before this federal stimulus package was approved.
Okay, so a minimum of 110, possibly 140 million. What is, and our enrollment is, we're anticipating it's going to be down. What is our average, or the increase that we're seeing over time? That, because if you look at the passage of the commercial activities tax, that revenue going in, local option increasing, the reason is it that the revenue, is it that the reason we have shortfalls is we're putting more into reserves, or that we're spending, the rate of spend is just exceeding the rate of new revenues, even though we've had a significant amount of new revenues?
So as you're going forward, that's the issue in the next biennium. There's a very small growth. If you look at the state school fund growth in the 5-year forecast, you can see that it's less than 1% for the next 2 years. And that's why we're having a shortfall.
But I guess I'm just looking at over the 5-year trend. Is it that our expenditures, because it's the revenues been increasing at a not insignificant amount? Is it that our expenditures are increasing at an even greater rate?
So
over time,
for general fund, for the next biennium, we're receiving less than 1% increase for state school fund. Normally we get more like a 4 or 5% increase. So it's a significant reduction in revenue over the next biennium in the general fund. And the reason why is because the current service level at the state level was calculated with the change in counted PERS savings that as a state average is offsets that lower revenue amount, so that current service level can be maintained on an average basis. Because PERS refinanced our PERS debt, because PPS refinanced our PERS debt 15 years ago, we realized that savings 15 years ago. And we've saved hundreds of millions of dollars over that 15 years. But now when others are receiving less revenue, their expenditures are going down. Our expenditures are not going down because we've already lowered them by refinancing our PERS debt.
And how many fewer students is this based on, for this forecast based on?
We assumed for next year that we've lost some students this year, so we assumed half of them would come back for next year.
So about a 700 student loss?
Pardon me?
About a 700 student loss, because I think we had 14 at the last enrollment count. We had 1,400.
I don't have the exact number, but I know that we counted half of them as coming back. So that's a conservative approach. We believe that as the vaccination gets out to our community, that our students will return to school.
Okay. Director Edwards, did you have more questions, or can we move on to another board member?
No, just before we have a vote, I'll have a comment.
Okay. I know we haven't heard from Director Scott, Director DePass, Director Constam, or Nathaniel. Who'd like to go next?
We haven't heard from me either. So.
Oh, sorry. I thought you already went. I'm losing track in my old age here. Okay, so who would like to speak next? Anyone really excited to take on Budget 101? I'm looking at Andrew Square, but he can't tell that I'm teasing him since he is the
And
budget.
it's not 101, it's like 605.
Right, that's true. Michelle, did you have something you wanted to add?
Well, a lot of the questions that I had have been answered already. I was curious when we said we're feeding all kids. Does that mean every student? I was just curious about that.
It means any student that comes and wants food or signs up for delivery at home.
Okay, so that means that's more than the identified families that need the assistance in the building or whatever.
Yeah. It's the federal program was changed during COVID, similar to the summer feeding program. So it's a different set of rules during the school year.
Yeah, and then my other, whenever we talk about budget, I admit I look to Andrew, Director Scott, like I'm just like, he's here. But my questions are about the summer school programming and making up for this loss, which is probably a different conversation, but I know we're going to spend some time talking about later. We already pre-COVID had huge gaps in achievement for kids. And we know that because of the pandemic, all kids are going to experience a loss. And so I'm trying to square just with myself. Are we talking about just the loss that kids are going to experience due to the pandemic? Or are we talking about those general gaps in achievement, which is something that I'm concerned about, have been concerned about for a very long time. And I know all of you here are concerned about as well. So I'm just trying to square this conversation now today with how we're using these resources and how we're going to accommodate these budget shortfalls over the next 5 years with the bigger issue of, are we addressing both of those gaps today or with this conversation, or are there two separate conversations happening? So I don't really have like a pointed question. I have a lot of questions in my mind. This is not my area of expertise, but I'm listening carefully and trying to learn.
Thanks, Michelle.
If I can just piggyback for a second on Michelle's question, I think what we're doing here tonight in this exercise is we're trying to enable staff to begin building the budget based on a critical assumption, which is what level of reserves are we starting from? And then they begin to build the budget. And if we think back to last year and the really thoughtful budget message and priorities that were put forward when the superintendent presented the proposed budget, it was all about how do we fund the strategies to achieve the goals that we've spent a lot of time and effort articulating around eliminating disparities in our district. And those are all the same challenges that we're going to have through the budget process in front of us. And it's all the more heartbreaking because we know they're exacerbated. We know they're going to be bigger for most of our kids, and we know that they're going to widen the gap because our students who were behind and underserved before are disproportionately hit by this pandemic and remote learning. So I have those same questions, but I think that that's really for our budget conversation, and we're really honing in on this one variable now. And Julie, I share your frustrations that it's hard to know where to land when we don't know the magnitude of the investments that we're going to have to make to remediate all of the effects of the learning loss. But I guess I depart from where you were coming from, Director Bailey, in that I don't think this is going to be about a 1-year intensive intervention investment. I think that the tail and the hangover from this period of remote learning is unfortunately going to be longer. And we're going to have to keep investing, making those additional investments in our students for the next 3 to 4 years in a way that looks pretty different than it would have looked had we not landed in this pandemic. So I guess I just wanted to jump in because I'm thinking about this process a little bit differently than jumping ahead to having to solve all the challenges of our overall budget process. And I look forward to seeing the superintendent's and the deputy superintendent's budget proposal that really tells us these are the strategies we need to invest in to address the learning loss this year and those persistent inequities and disparities that we've had for way too long.
I really appreciate everybody's sort of thoughtful stances, and I really appreciate that, Director Constan. This is one of the things I think we've talked about that we appreciate about our board is that we are different and that we have different perspectives, and that this is exactly the kind of conversation where we can learn from one another and grow and stretch. Director Scott, I saw that you unmuted. Did you have some things to add to this conversation?
Dr. Moore was also unmuted, so I don't want to jump ahead if she was ready to go.
No, go ahead.
Thanks. Let me bring up my notes here. Yeah, and
notes. Look at that.
I know, did I give that away? I'll try. They've been typing it sort of as we go. I'll try. I might sound, if I sound a little preachy, I apologize. So forgive me for that. But
I'm really well versed when people sound preachy, so I'll make a song if you get
good. No, I appreciate that, Ailey. It wasn't even intended as a as a comment about you, but I appreciate that. So I am going to support the staff recommendation for scenario number 4. For a number of reasons. And for me, I think sort of starting off, it was good context to go back. And I spent a lot of time with government budgets, but I haven't spent a lot of time with school budgets. So I really am learning about school district budgeting, and it is different in a lot of key ways. But I think it was useful for me, the context of starting off, recognizing that we're not a well-reserved school district. And that's not a slam on current staff or leadership, because we are better than we were before, and we have been making steady progress. And it takes a long time to build up solid reserves. But our reserves we're not starting off in a good place, right? We've got reserves of 9% in this fiscal year. GFOA recommends that reserve be over 16, just over 16% in sort of ending fund balance. And I think it is worth just pointing out, had we been at 16% going into this pandemic, we would have had more flexibility to deal with the COVID-related learning loss that I think all of us as a board are unanimous, and I know the superintendent and his leadership team are unanimous in wanting to address. So that is one of the reasons why you start at a better place, is because when these things hit, it gives us more flexibility to respond. And that really is why I'm concerned with some of the other scenarios that staff have laid out for us. And I want to echo what other board members have said. I really appreciate the process. I think the information's been really clear. I'm glad we have this chance for more discussion, and I'm glad to hear from all the board, because I think we do bring different perspectives to it. But I'm concerned about scenarios that take that reserve even lower than it currently is, and including scenario number 4, which takes it down to 8%. Concerns me a little bit as well. I don't love the term rainy day fund. I don't think that's helpful in our public discussion, because I think rainy day fund evokes a discretionary fund that you can sort of do whatever you want with, and you can take a vacation, or you can buy a new car, or whatever. It's like a rainy day fund. And in reality, our ending fund balance is what keeps the district solvent. If that ending fund balance drops to 0, the school district shuts down. Under law, like, we can't operate without operating reserve. And so, pandemic or not, or other things, we have to close our doors. And so that's why it's such a key role of the board, this sort of fiscal, responsibility of like what is the right thing to do moving forward. And I also want to point out, I mean, we think about reserves as a way to sort of ease some of the issues that we're dealing with right now, but really what they're there for are things like pandemics, and we are spending down our reserve already in order to deal with this pandemic. Floods that might happen, fires and earthquakes, those sound unrealistic, but they're not. If we lost one of our schools, right, in a fire, we could easily rack up tens of millions of dollars in a heartbeat that we would need to spend.
2020 wasn't enough chaos and destruction for you. You're now, predicting floods and fires and earthquakes. Thank you.
Not predicting, but just noting that anything is possible.
Preaching. And the locusts?
Going back to preaching and fire and brimstone.
The locusts. I mean, the locusts could really cost a lot of money as well. But I think that, that's really when I think of a reserve, what I think about is that, are those things that are so unexpected that we would need to react to very, very quickly that could cost tens of millions of dollars that we would need to have. The other thing, and this is secondary for me, but it's not unimportant, it is our bond rating. And we do have a really strong bond rating because of, prior boards and good fiscal decisions. To the extent we spend down our reserve, it's hard to say when the bond rating agencies would make a change, but to the extent we spend it down significantly, and we saw that bond rating decline, it would mean, tens of millions of dollars less in infrastructure spending from our bonds that we're currently, spending right now. And so I don't think that's as important as the other reasons for reserve, but I do think it is an important one I don't want to leave behind. So I do support number 4, because I think what I appreciate about it is it forces us to make the hard decisions that put us on a sustainable path going forward. The sooner we make those hard decisions, actually the less impactful they will be, because they accumulate over time. I'm a little worried. Scenario 3 I think is intriguing, but I think we're actually a little less likely to have stimulus in the second year. And so I think, we'd be kicking the can down the road a little bit. But I think, as other people have pointed out, those costs are going to be substantial no matter what. And I would rather sort of bite the bullet and make some tough decisions to get us back on a sustainable path earlier, rather than kick the can down the road, which could potentially mean a larger cut or smaller reserve at the end of the process. And the other thing I want to point out is, with scenario 3, we would end up with a 7% reserve. Well, we still need to get that up to 15 or 16%. So that means a much longer process as well. Not much longer, but a little bit longer process than an 8% reserve. And I guess I want to point out, even at number 4, we're taking, where we are taking significant cuts, we still end up with a reserve that's less than 50% of recommended levels. So for all of those reasons, for me, I support number 4. It is going to be painful. I think we need to continue making the case at the state and federal level, for additional funding. I'm optimistic that some of that, may occur and may happen. But I think for me, the fiscally responsible thing to do is to make those decisions early, and again, get us on that sustainable path. #end rant.
All right. Well, if we're talking about rants, then I think we should turn to Dr. Moore.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I'll try to keep the rants in check, but I can't promise anything. So I am not in favor of 4. I am in favor of 3, which I think presents us options for different decisions going forward. So I just want to address Director Scott's articulation of the reasons behind having why it's important to have fund balance or reserves. And I'm going to venture a little bit into territory that is not my area of expertise. So Claire, I'm going to ask, if I say something inaccurate or stupid, stop me. But my understanding is that GFOA recommends 16% reserves for most governmental entities, but it is highly unusual. I think it's probably non-existent, in fact, for a school district to have that much in reserves. I think the standard, the goal for most school districts is 10% rather than 16. Is that fair, Claire? I think it's the rare district.
It depends on what state you live in. And I had this conversation with Nathaniel earlier this evening that we used to be towards the bottom of when you look nationally in dollars per student spent or even revenue received. And we have recently with Measure 98 and SIA or Student Success Act, the two of those combined have moved us into the average in the middle. So nationally, we're now in the middle, where before I would say, so those that are at the top, like New York, New Jersey, their reserves are higher because it's easier to do when you have more resources. So, so when they go for a bond rating, they get a AAA, top of the line rating because they are financially solvent. I think it was harder for us when we were at the bottom for us to do that. When we've moved to the middle, I think our reserves should be increasing.
Okay, so
Okay.
so increasing, but I actually think 16 is probably beyond reach for the foreseeable future. Okay, 2. When Ailey and I were on CRBC, whenever that was, years ago, 4 years ago, we helped champion the policy that PPS as a district should increase the reserves and maintain reserves sufficient to accommodate, the kind of disasters you're talking about. And I continue to hold that view. At the same time, I think we have to acknowledge that we are in the middle of a world historical moment with the pandemic. And while I understand the need to have robust reserves, I don't think that is our prime directive. I think our prime directive is doing the best we can for the kids, given the circumstances. And we have to be prudent and take a long-term view, which is why I'm really happy that we're doing this. Having a 5-year horizon gives us a lot more consistency in practice, and it's going to allow us to be more deliberate in the way we spend our limited resources. So I am not in favor of drawing down on the reserves in perpetuity, or even over the next 5 years. But I do think at this moment, we know that we're going to have extraordinary expenditures, certainly for the coming year, possibly beyond that. And I think no matter what the level of learning loss has been, we probably won't know that really until next year with any real certainty. So there's so much that's unpredictable. But I do think it is predictable that we're going to have to invest in our children to the degree they need it. So I am in favor of drawing down on the fund balance 2% for the following year, for next year.
So Director Moore, would you like to make an amendment to the motion before us to reflect that?
Well, I would like to recommend scenario 3.
Right. The motion that we put on the table recommends scenario 4. So if we want to, I think the sort of process way forward, we can keep discussing this, which I think we will, but if you wanted to espouse that viewpoint, we can try to make an amendment to reflect that, see where that goes. But if you're not ready to make that amendment at this point, we can keep discussing.
Well, let me just say maybe 2 more sentences about scenario 3. I think scenario 3 provides a good balance between the need to prepare for extraordinary expenditures next year, but also maintains a healthy fund balance going forward. And depending on how things shake out over the next 2, 3, 4 years, we could adjust that fund balance upward. I mean, if we can give any credence at all to the state projections about the economy over the next couple of years, it looks like this is going to be an unusually short recession. So we might be able to anticipate, in the 2022-23 year that we're even under both scenario 3 and scenario 4, we're looking at, still significant shortages, shortfalls. We might be able to mitigate that through an increase in the general fund budget. Anyway, it gives us an opportunity to do the immediate investments that we're going to need to respond to the pandemic, but also maintains a healthy reserve level going forward. Okay, so I guess I would recommend that we amend the resolution to read scenario 3 rather than scenario 4.
Okay, so Director Moore has an amendment before us to amend the resolution to reflect scenario 3 rather than scenario 4. Do I have a second for that amendment?
I'll second it.
All right, is there discussion on the Moore amendment?
I have a question. So we're not actually, if we voted for this, it's just voting for the substitution. It's not actually voting for the option 3 yet.
Correct. So
that would be, it would be the substitution.
It would be a substituting 3 for 4. We'd have to vote on the amendment. If the amendment passes, we would still have to ultimately vote on the resolution.
I just want to clarify.
I have a question. Yeah. The current draft resolution shows an 8% fund balance rather than a scenario.
Okay, so we would be moving to 7%
yes.
Fund balance. Sorry, thank you, Claire, for catching that. So it would reflect scenario 3, which would mean the language would change to a 7% fund balance.
Chair Larry, I have a question for staff. Claire, I apologize for doing math on my own during a board meeting. I think I promised never to do that, but yet here I am. Is it accurate that the difference between scenario 4, which keeps fund balance at 8%, and scenario 3, which moves it to 7, that in scenario 4, we're currently drawing down 15% of our reserves, and I'm taking those numbers from your summary table, that our current reserves $63.6 million, and in 21-22 we would draw that down to $54 million, so roughly $9 million, or about 15% drawdown of reserves, and that proposal number 3 would draw down reserves by about 26%. Am I missing anything with that analysis?
Now you're making Claire do math.
If you're wanting me to verify that percentage, I need to just a moment with my calculator.
Okay, yeah, no, again, I apologize.
You have the correct, your logic follows. I just haven't verified the number.
So I'll talk while you verify to make sure I didn't miss anything. Yeah, no, I thought it's useful for me to sort of look at, and just again for context, that scenario 4 is in fact using our rainy day fund to the tune of about 15% of our existing, and I'm going to call it a reserve.
I thought we weren't going to call it that.
No, I'm correcting myself. Thank you, Haley. That it uses about 15% of our reserve, and scenario 3 uses about roughly 26% of the reserve. So I think that's useful. And then I actually have another question for Claire, but I already asked you to do that.
I'll jump in and say the one thing about looking at scenario 3 and 4. We cut this about the same amount, a little over 26 million, either 3 or 4. For me, the difference is when we cut that. So it's the trade-off of we cut more in year 2 than in year 1, but we still cut ultimately the same amount, but then we also lose more of our reserves. So there is definitely a high cost to scenario 3.
Yeah, no, and I think that's an excellent point, because that is the trade-off. We end at the end of our 5-year period with a 7% reserve. We cut the same amount ultimately, but we end with a 7% reserve versus cutting the same with an 8%. But you don't have to cut it all in year one. You can cut some of it in year two. My second question, and you answered it earlier, and I don't think I followed. With this new stimulus, this $29 million stimulus, could that mitigate our need to take these first year reductions? And I know that's one-time stimulus money. These are ongoing potential reductions needed in the 5-year forecast. And this question was already asked and answered, and I'm sorry, I've forgotten your answer.
So I think there are so many variables here. We can certainly use the stimulus dollars to help offset the additional costs that happen for next year. And if if we ended up adding staffing, creating long-term expense over with short-term money, that means we would eventually have to figure out how to pay for that or reduce it, right? So one thing I want to remind the board is that once a year now, we're going to have this discussion. So while we're looking at 5 years at once, all those numbers will change by the time we get to next year, because our funding level will be determined for the biennium. So just know that we took a stick in the sand on the day that we did the forecast with the best information that we had. And the next time we do a forecast, it would be different. It will be different because your spending patterns change and your revenue collection patterns change, right? And so I know that you're really working on trying to do the right thing. And so I want to give you some comfort in that we have reserves to address anomalies that come forward, right? That's one of the reasons we have them. We also want to be prudent in our long-term look, which you guys have done that diligently, going through and looking at the multiple years. And just know this isn't the last time you get to do that. You get to do this over and over again, and we're continuing to give you quarterly reports to track on how we're doing based on the forecasts, right? And then again, next fall, we will have the same process where you get to set a new number. We'll know a lot more. We'll know by then, we'll probably have an assessment with children and know what we're dealing with. Right now, the difference between 7 or 8% is manageable. Okay, we're going to manage whatever you bring forward to us. But what's most important than anything is that you bring a number forward so that we can make a plan with the number you're bringing forward. You've heard our recommendation because we're being fiscally good stewards. And you are also thinking about all the children and all their needs. Can't argue with either point. Just so I know you're going to make the right decision in whichever one it is. But I'm hoping, Scott, that or Andrew, that I'm helping to answer your question. But it is.
We haven't heard from this. Sorry, Claire. I thought you were finished.
25% is what I got, but under pressure in a board meeting, I don't like to do calculations.
We should have rules about what we can do math.
Yeah.
I just wanted to check in because we haven't heard from Nathaniel yet, but I did want to, I saw Amy wanted to respond to Claire, and I did I just wanted to briefly say, I think your comment about assessments is really important, Deputy Superintendent, because I think, as we are deploying resources, we really want to, again, think long-term and thoughtfully about where those goes. And I know that the MAP assessment that we'll be doing in January will help us to do that, to know to have some data. We think we know, we have a lot of guesses about learning loss, but I think it'd be really helpful to have that snapshot as we continue to try to look at summer school and other resources for our most at needs kiddos. And I'm really fascinated by what we were seeing from the national numbers around math and seeing if that's true here in Portland and where especially we can help improve math. Nathaniel, do you have any thoughts about this process or any questions you wanted to weigh in on this discussion?
Yeah. Can you?
You're cutting out. Can other people hear Nathaniel? You're cutting out. Can other people
And Nathaniel, a screen looks frozen to me. So I think that the internet is intermittent.
Okay, I'm gonna try and.
I can hear you now,
I'm gonna try to
Nathaniel.
join through my phone.
Maybe if you turn off your video, we'll be able to hear you.
Okay. I.
No, it's still cutting out, Nathaniel. If you could try to call in, that would be great. I'm so sorry. We're having internet issues here.
Could I, one or two quick comments?
Be moved into the
Oh, wait. If Nathaniel's on, he's on. No.
Okay, so Nathaniel's going to call in and Kara will move him in. While we're waiting, we'll hear from Director Bailey.
Yeah, first of all, I want to gently correct Director Constam. I think this, who thought I said we need 1 year. No, we need a multi-year. I think we're going to need multi-year extra interventions for our students. So we're in agreement there. I do feel kind of like it's 1929 and President Hoover wants to balance the budget, that's the most important thing. That's a little bit of an overstatement, but we have, I mean, we had huge needs pre-COVID that we were not going to be able to really satisfactorily address. Now it's well beyond that. I talked to a teacher at an upper income elementary school, and I said, you know, ballpark it, where are your kids compared to where they should be? And they thought around 50%. That is, they had learned about half of what they would have learned in a normal year, with a few kids right on target and a few kids way behind. And that's at an upper income school. We have, and I think MAP will show, we will have substantial learning loss. And I want to give our staff the resources to be able to have a really robust response to where kids are. So, you know, I'll vote for 3 because I think that's where we can get a majority, maybe. I would go down, I would cut reserves even further. I think we need the money. And if we get some unexpected dollars from the feds or even from the state, great, we can adjust the budget then and not take so much out of reserves. But I want in this budget for our staff to have resources to really address what we can. And I don't want us to budget on reserves. I want us to budget on kids. And that's not to say that, you know, Andrew, that you didn't bring up some great points about the importance of reserves. Yeah, but we're in a pickle, my friends. And it's a big pickle. And we know, using the equity lens, who has been hurt the most. I'll stop there.
I believe Nathaniel's here because his thing says talking permitted. So Nathaniel? Looks like he's muted. Kara, can you unmute Nathaniel?
I can't. I just asked him to unmute.
Oh, okay. Great. Nathaniel?
Yeah.
All right, we can hear you. Great.
Okay, great. I'm sorry, Wi-Fi hasn't been cooperating all day. Yeah. So I don't know if I really have that much to contribute to the conversation.
Nathaniel, you went really quiet there for a second, Nathaniel.
Oh, I'm sorry. Do I have to hold it like a microphone? Oh,
That's better.
Yeah. So what I was saying is that I met with Claire prior to the meeting, and it was really helpful to gain more insight into how all of this works. But there's still so many complexities. But the way I see it as of now is that any course of action we take is going to have considerable downsides, or at least has the potential to. And that I believe that it is critical to protect and increase our reserves whenever possible, but that it is also extremely important to combat the inevitable learning loss that we're going to see, especially for our younger students. And I don't know if we really have a plan here that can strike that balance adequately, but I don't know if we can, given our current situation. I think the only thing that really solves the problem is going to be substantial outside funding, the likes of which we don't have at this time. So I don't know. I see the merits of both 3 and 4. I don't know.
I think you kind of summed up very well there. This sort of like you said, there's potential downsides on all decisions, and there's also potential upsides. So this is why board members get the big bucks to make these decisions. And those of you watching may not know that being on the board is a volunteer position. So I think Director Constant was going to say something, Director Moore, and then maybe Director Scott, unless you had anything else to add, Nathaniel. All right, Director Constant.
Thanks, Nathaniel. I share your verbal hand wringing, but I also think it's hard because right now we're sort of talking about 2 different options, which is very reductive. I think we all want to feel comfortable with our ability to invest in the incredible needs that we know that we're going to have. It's just a question of very slightly different approaches. And Claire, when I wanted to jump in before, it was just that you articulated exactly what I had been thinking about. We're laying out a framework right here, but we're not beholden to maintain that framework in our consideration of next year's, the following year's budget or the subsequent 3 years. I mean, you focused on the fact that our revenue picture will change. Well, lots of other things will change too. Our policymaking perspectives may change, our understanding of what the actual costs may change, our composition of our board may change. We don't deprive ourselves as a board and district of the opportunity to change course in those subsequent years. I'll just put my 2 cents in here before we take a vote. I would support scenario 4 because I think it already has a pretty significant depletion of our reserves. And we have made a really strong commitment as a board and a school district to try to be more fiscally responsible. And I agree that these are extraordinary times, but the reason that we got in a situation where our reserves were so drastically low was because school boards over the years weren't willing and able to make the really hard decisions. I mean, we are an underfunded district in an underfunded state, and there are always heartbreaking choices that have to be made with every budget cycle. And I think it is fair to say that this one more so than others, but it's always hard and there's never enough money. And that's why we got in such a dire situation that we made a real commitment to try to remedy. So I don't think scenario 4 is saying we just want to sit on a whole bunch of money and not invest in our kids. I think we're already are taking a big hit. And I think that we can't overstate the importance of continuing advocacy for federal funding and state funding, although, the state's in a dire position as well. Once we really know what it's going to cost to dig ourselves out of this hole and attend to the needs of our kids. So that's where I stand.
Right. Director Moore, and then Director Scott, and then whoever's ready after that.
Okay, so I think my cat has something to add to the conversation. So I think I'm going to piggyback on what Amy was just saying. We are an underfunded district in an underfunded state that has disinvested in public education for generations. The pandemic has simply made visible the costs of that, the human cost. We have structural inequities. We have structural deficit. And we're having to look ahead to, a 5-year horizon that is completely unknowable in many ways. I do think we need to respond to the crisis in front of us, but I am actually more concerned about the numbers at the top of this chart, the budget shortfall between 2021 and 2026. And I'm looking at a total over 5 years of $212 million shortfall. That is a horrifying number. And we can do things in the interim to maybe lower that number, but I think it reflects a financial situation that is problematic going forward. So, it's probably a bigger conversation than we can have tonight, but I would like to have more information about what's driving the shortfalls, what is within our control, and what are the factors driving the shortfall that are not within PPS's control, but that we can have some impact on, some influence over. And, I will say it again, the current service level formula is a structural problem that is going to compound year over year until we fix it. That's the one that I know about. I'm sure there are other things that are driving these shortfalls over time. So going forward, I would like us to look to use this instrument as a way to kind of look ahead to what are the issues that we can be dealing with, or we should be forecasting for, and what can we do about it. So that's my little soapbox. And a lot of this is, I'm going to echo Scott. Austerity budgets don't work. They don't fix budget shortfalls. They are inhumane. They may be, politically appealing in the moment, but we cannot continue to disinvest in our people. So whatever we can do as the biggest district in the state to exhort and demand from the state adequate resources to invest in our children, I think we should be doing. Okay, end of my rant. Thank you.
So I think what we'll do here is we'll hear from Dr. Scott, and then I'm going to go ahead and ask Ms. Bradshaw if we have any public comment, because I feel like before we vote on this amendment, we really need to hear from our public investors here. So Director Scott, did you have something to add?
Yeah, so I'm going to oppose the amendment because I think option number 4 is better. But I just want to say, if the board supports option number 3, I may still vote for that in the end, because I think, as Deputy Superintendent Hertz pointed out, these are, there are answers. There's not a right or a wrong answer, right? There are just different trade-offs with each of these. So, but I also wanted to, and I always hesitate to actually correct a real economist, but I know Director Bailey can take it. I think the issue and frankly the reason why the Hoover analogy doesn't work is because the federal government is not required to balance its budget. We are required by law to do that. And I think that we can talk, and I think all 7 of us would believe that, yes, if we could deficit spend, if that was an option, by all means, now is the time to do it. But we can't, and we're not allowed to, and we're required by law to balance our budget. And for me, the risk of spending down further than we are, which is already, I'll point out, very low, is that if there's and I'm going to say it again, be the doomsayer, if there's another pandemic wave, right, and COVID comes back, if there's other things that hit us, the catastrophic impact to our children of a district that is insolvent far, far outweighs any of the kind of impact that we're talking about today. And so I want to keep that perspective in mind. We can want all we can hope all we want that we can spend our way out of this, but we actually don't have the legal authority to do that. The spending needed to help our students is far greater than the $60 million that's in our reserve. But if we blow through that entire $60 million and the school district shuts down and is taken over by the state, we haven't done our students any favor. So I think it's important to push back on that. We are just in a very different position than the federal government. This is not an austerity budget because we want it to be. It's an austerity budget because we have a responsibility not to make the district insolvent.
All right, I'm gonna.
You're right, Andrew. That wasn't. I wasn't using that as a direct analogy, and you know that, and I know that. But the analogy is our reserves, and as Director Constam has put it, we have the choice of sitting on cash or spending it on kids when this is an extraordinary situation. If we weren't in an extraordinary situation, then I would give more weight to the fund balance. But this is extraordinary.
And I think
and there is, and just
down,
really quick, sorry, there is a significant risk of spending that down. And I just want to make sure that all the board members are aware and acknowledging that risk.
And I think what Director Constam actually said was scenario 4 shows that we are not willing to sit on cash. We're already spending down some of that to serve kids. So I just want to make sure what she said wasn't misrepresented. All right, I'm going to ask.
Thank you, Chair Lowry.
yeah. I just want to make sure, I wanted to ask Ms. Bradshaw if there's any public comment on this tonight.
We do have a public comment, and it's Elizabeth Thiel.
Hi, everybody. Elizabeth Thiel. I am the currently serving as the president of the Portland Association of Teachers. Good evening and happy new year to you.
And Elizabeth, before you get started, I'm just going to ask that you spell your last name for the record. Not that we don't already know it. And also to just remind you, you have 3 minutes and you'll hear a sound at the end of that time. And to thank you so much for being willing to provide public testimony tonight.
And I believe as PAT president, I do get to speak more than 3 minutes.
Ooh, what's the rule, Liz? Roseanne? Do we have, I don't know what the rule is.
I don't think I have a limit, but I won't take too much longer.
Good.
The contract allows essentially an unlimited.
Sweet, then never mind. You
I'll
don't
talk
get
all night. Yeah.
And
okay,
we
cool.
all learned something tonight, so that's a great night.
All right, hit it, Elizabeth.
Happy to help. And so Elizabeth Thiel, Thiel. So first of all, I appreciate this conversation and all of your dedication to fiscal stewardship of our school system and making the best choices for our students, giving the resources that we anticipate. Thanks for allowing me to speak a little bit to this resolution. At this time of uncertainty and unique need, framing a difficult budget conversation around a central goal makes sense. I believe that centering the building of reserves or the preservation of reserves in the creation of our budget for next year is not the right value though for this time. There's a lot of things we don't know about next school year or the school years after that. But there are some things that we know for sure. Next school year, our students will be coming to us with needs that are greater than ever. And just to get back to where we were before the pandemic would require more resources than we've had, and then not less. And I know that we share a much more ambitious goal than getting back to where we were before to meet our students' academic, social, and emotional and relational needs better than we ever have in the past. We've seen the cumulative impact of what happens when students' needs go unmet. We've been living it in Oregon for the past decade or so. And that's why we have been fighting to increase public school funding. Last year, after winning the Student Success Act, we were finally able to spend time making plans for how to better serve our students, particularly our students of color. And because of that work, we have more counselors this year than we've had. We've had more social workers than we've ever had. We have more educators providing academic support. We couldn't have known a year ago just how badly we needed all of those folks, but we know right now that we will still need them next year. In this context, voting to prioritize the PPS reserves is the equivalent of cutting staff. And I want to talk about what that means to our school communities and the negative impacts that it creates. And in a best case scenario, when we make staffing cuts early in the budget process, we sometimes get to add those folks back later on after we successfully advocate for funds, or when the conservative estimates end up being more conservative than the reality. And this seems like prudent planning. But on the ground, it is hugely disruptive to schools and students and staff. When we cut staff, it's our newest hires who are unassigned or laid off, and the district loses the investment in those crucial employees. Worse, the school community loses a beloved community member who wants to be there in that school. And when frequently, luckily, positions are added back, the staff member has already moved on, taken a different position, or frequently left our school district or the profession. And we know that our CSI and our TSI schools have the highest share of new educators and are impacted the most. It has a huge impact on the stability of our schools and our programs. We can fight for resources that we need and add them to our reserves when we get them. The reserve doesn't mind whether those resources are there in May or June or July or August. But when we're talking about people's careers, it makes so much difference. After you've been told that you are unassigned, it is devastating for your employer to tell you that in the spring, even if we say we're fighting to get you back later. So when we're fighting we can fight for these resources, and not, I'm sorry, I lost my spot here on my notes. But when we cut our staff, we do irreparable harm to our school communities and programs. And we undermine our shared goal of retaining our recently hired educators of color that we've been working so hard to add to our district. And on the subject of fighting for resources, I also want to point out that our stock market is booming. The New York Times reported this weekend that overall in the United States, wages are higher in 2020 than 2019. Overall, they are just going to fewer people. We cannot accept austerity and cuts that exacerbate inequality in Oregon or anywhere in the United States. It is not true that there's not the resources out there to support our students. So we need to fight for that. And in the meantime, the reason we have a budget reserve is to provide continuity and a cushion for hard times. And this is clearly exactly the kind of time that reserves are for. It does not make sense to me as an educator or a parent to make preserving the reserves the central priority. Rather, I urge you to build a budget that prioritizes stability for our students and the supports that they need. Thank you.
Thanks, Elizabeth. And I just got a text that the next time we need to add you to the agenda so we don't have that awkwardness about time limits. So sorry for that.
No problem.
We are all good. Was there any other public comment, Ms. Bradshaw?
No, that's it.
Okay, great. I had a question for Deputy Superintendent Hurst, and that is, so let's say we pass the Moore Amendment, and then we go with scenario 3, 7% reserves. Does that mean we're locked into having to spend down to 7%? Let's say, the Biden administration gives every school district $1 billion. Can we, 7's the maximum we can spend down to. We're not required to do that if we get a bunch more money, correct?
That's correct. The way the resolution reads is a minimum 7%.
So that's the most we could spend down, but if we did get a windfall, if the economy turns around more quickly, we can leave our reserves higher.
Yeah, and in budgeting at a 7% fund balance, our actuals are always different than our budget because we're budgeting 18 months before the year ends, right? So budget and actuals will never equal each other. But we're budgeting with our best knowledge now what we will end on June 30th of 2022.
Okay, thank you for answering that question. I appreciate it.
Hey, Chair Lowry, I didn't see any kind of input or recommendation from the CVRC on this resolution?
There was not, oh, excuse me, I'll let Dr.
Or either of you.
Either Dr. Moore or Deputy Superintendent Hurst can answer that one.
Defer to Dr. Moore.
Well, to my knowledge, the CBSC was not asked for a recommendation. They were briefed. And I mean, to some degree, it's, I think it was a function of, it took a while for the CBRC to kind of get organized. We had a number of vacancies and a bunch of people had to be recruited. But to my knowledge, the CBRC was not asked to make a recommendation.
I would like to say that I'm really missing their input in this conversation, because this is exactly the kind of question that we convene them to advise us on. And in every single report that they've made to the board during the budget season since I've been on the board, their number one issue has been about how to build a healthier reserve, since historically this district has been fiscally quite irresponsible with regard to reserves. So I'm feeling a big miss here about not having their formal input or even any public testimony from any of their members.
I want to second what Director Constam just said, and that we employ these volunteers to give us their best thinking, and to not hear from them is really unfortunate. We sometimes as individuals aren't the best thinkers, and it helps inform our decision making to hear from others that have different experiences. I would just encourage us to recruit. Again, I have 10 people. I've got their emails that want to volunteer, that are strong applicants that care about the district. And that's for another day. But I just feel like it's a really difficult, I feel like I'm making a decision in a vacuum that's not diverse enough and not broad enough. It's just really unfortunate that we couldn't hear from them tonight.
Yeah, I think that was an oversight, and I apologize for that we didn't pull the CBRC in on this, and we will make sure that in the future that
and so process-wise, do we need to make a decision tonight, or can we go back to them and ask them?
We've already put off this vote, so this is the latest we could make the decision. So we have to make a decision tonight. We were supposed to make a decision at the end of December, and we actually called this special meeting so we could have more time to discern and get data and be briefed and have conversations.
Okay, and you let me finish the question, but I think you sort of answered it. Thank you.
I'm sorry, what requirement is that we have to make a decision? Is there something in our policy or in statute?
It's about our budget time. So the budget timeline that we adopted in the fall had this on there, and that we need to finish this, make the decision tonight so that we can move forward on our budgeting process.
So it's a self-imposed something that
I think we should have
wait if we wanted.
We could, yeah, Deputy Hertz should speak to that.
Yeah, I'm curious too about that, because I have a work plan I work from at work, and I have deadlines all over the place all year long, and many times they have to be moved. So I'm just curious also, based on your question, Director Brum Edwards, about does this have to, are we going to die if we don't do it tonight, or could we improve our process by extending this out 10 days and asking the CBRC to weigh in?
So the CBRC did have a conversation and asked questions. The comments that I received back were, they were pleased to see that we were looking at a 5-year financial forecast, and starting a new practice of having this conversation with the board on an annual basis. They were pleased to see the growth in the fund balance. They were pleased to see that we were recommending a small usage of fund balance as the staff recommendation. So those were the comments that I received from the CBRC. So they, I would say we had 2 leaders at the start of the year. One resigned, and we then got new leadership on board. We have a lot of new members. It's not that there aren't members. There's just a lot of new members. we had a committee meeting that was scheduled for 1 hour because it was during the Christmas holidays. And so there were a lot of circumstances in place in that the CBRC is just starting up with a new group, a lot of new members. And so in terms of why it's important to do it now, we have 4 budget meetings that are internal and where we're looking to make our recommendation for our proposed budget. Make a recommendation to the superintendent who would bring something forward to the board. We have a goal of starting staffing early in time frame in terms of March. In order to meet that March 1 staffing timeline, we would need to have our process done by the end of January in order to have staffing start by March. If we delay this decision, we can't finalize the proposed budget proposal going to the superintendent, and then we would have to, it would lead to a delay in staffing into later in the year, which has always been a goal to keep it early in the year so that we can have the best applicants and have teachers hired before school starts in the fall. So that's the reason we're on the timeline that we're on. It doesn't mean that we can't go beyond it, but what it does is it snowballs and has an impact on many other things that are that have already been approved by this board and in a budget calendar. We can certainly amend the budget calendar, but it does have an impact on when we'd be able to start our staffing process.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I also, this has been such an extraordinary year that I would be in favor of pushing things out, knowing what you just said, that that's tremendous pressure on staff to make a decision so you can get to, you know, those hiring decisions through the summer and fall. Because I really feel like the way we do our work matters, and who we consult matters, and who we hear from and whose voices are elevated and whose we are not listening to matters. So that's just my own personal appeal to hearing from the CBRC. I don't know if I'm alone in that or not, but that I'm just expressing my own views and my own wish to have been more intentional about
having them in the loop. Yeah.
Having them in the loop and having them inform us. I mean, we're all here for the best outcomes, right? For kids, we have that. All have the same goal, and so how we get there matters.
So, would you like to make a motion to table this matter?
Can I say something before we move on? Before we address that question?
Before we have that, I would also like Chief HR Officer Sharon Reese added to the room so that she could explain more about the staffing timeline.
Okay, so let's hear from Rita, and then we'll hear from Sharon, and then we'll go back to Michelle or Amy or Director Brim Edwards, who all raised this issue as well, if we want to make a motion to table this. So, Director Moore, what was your question?
No, I don't have a question. I wanted to reinforce what Deputy Superintendent Hertz said about the tenor of the conversation within CBRC. They were thoroughly briefed on the document and walked through the different scenarios and the projections. There were some questions. They were engaged in the conversation, but I did not hear anyone who appeared to have any serious concerns about the direction that the district was headed in. There was no, it's a pretty engaged bunch, and if they're unhappy, they are not reticent to make their views known. And people seem to be fairly copacetic with what was being presented to them. So given that, I don't think it's necessary in this particular instance to delay our decision-making. I would endorse the notion that going forward, we should be more intentional about including the CBRC at these, kind of critical milestones in the budget process. But I think in this particular instance, given what I heard, I don't think I did not get the sense from the people in that room that they felt they needed to, oppose the proposal, or that they had any significant concerns. So there it is.
Ms. Reese, would you like to talk about the hiring implications?
Yes, so our ability to go what we refer to as external with posting jobs is one of the downstream consequences to our budgeting timeline. And of course, the later in the hiring season that we are able to post jobs externally, and of course, the difference between the external posting and the internal posting is we are required to go through a process according to our collective bargaining agreement of posting positions internally. So internal applicants have first shot at those positions. The downstream consequences, of course, are we are able to post those positions later in the season. That means our candidate pools are smaller. And I think it's safe to say that also has a negative impact on our ability to recruit diverse candidates, which is a high priority for us. In this last year, before the pandemic hit, we were on track to staff externally in the earliest we had for quite some time on April 6th. We're already later this year, and we're hoping for an April 20th external round posting right now, which is certainly later than we are hoping. So there are consequences from a staffing perspective for delays in budgeting decisions.
So I'll turn back to Directors DePass, Constam, and Brim-Edwards. Would any of you like to make a motion to table the matter that is before us at this time?
I don't have any interest in doing that. I was just raising the issue of why we had to vote that it wasn't by statute or anything else. So just clarifying that.
I do not.
I don't either. I was simply raising a question.
Okay, is there any further discussion on the Moore amendment? All right, we will now vote on the Moore amendment, which substitutes 7% for 8% in resolution 6222. All in favor, please indicate by saying yes. Yes.
Yes.
Okay. All opposed, please indicate by saying no.
No.
Any abstaining? Okay, so you're gonna have to help me with math here because I didn't hear everyone. So I had Director Moore, Director Lowry, Director DePass, and was it Director Bailey voting for the amendment, and then Director Constam, Director Scott, and Director Brim-Edwards voting against it?
I think so.
Okay, so the amendment, the amendment passes 4-3 with Student Representative Hsu voting
Abstain.
Abstain. Okay, thank you, Nathaniel. All right, we now move on to resolution 6222 as amended. Is there any further discussion on this resolution?
So I have just going to explain because I'm going to vote no on this. I'm with Director Bailey on the issue that I think we have the the depth of what we're going to need to make up is not going to be, 1%, moving from 8 to 7, or, potentially we might have to spend even more than that. And having been through, living through the 2001 recession, when we had very little reserves, the community did what it needed to do in order to fund our schools, and that was the teachers working for 2 weeks for free, the community buckling down with passing a local income tax surcharge. So I've seen kind of the arc of what it's like to climb out of a tough budget hole. But I think when in the past, the difference is we haven't also had potentially such a large learning loss. My preference, and I think, and I said this from the very beginning, I'm not comfortable with backing in, like picking as our anchor point, here's what the reserves are, and then work from that, telling the staff, let's work from that. I much prefer that the staff come up with a budget that they feel addresses the potential learning loss, and to Director DePass's point, also works on our board goals of accelerating gains for Black, Indigenous, special ed, English language learners, and that if based on that budget we have reserves of 10%, great, but if they're 4%, I'd much rather live with that and know that we built the budget around what the educators in the district felt we needed, versus just, from my own personal thing, it seems somewhat random to pick, going from 8 to 7 seems like, well, maybe that's 2,000 kids that aren't going to get it because, if we left it at 8. Versus going down to 7. So I'm just uncomfortable starting the process with the reserve number versus staff and the superintendent and the educators coming with here's what we know to the best of our knowledge and what we can do. So I'm going to be a no on this resolution because I have a greater degree of comfort with moving the reserves in this unprecedented situation. But that's just my own personal comfort level. And I understand why other people have different comfort levels.
Again, I think that's one of the good things about our board is that we do have differences and we share them and learn from one another. Other comments before we vote on the resolution before?
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Director Bailey.
We'll do Bailey, Sam, then Scott.
Okay. I agree with Director Brim-Edwards' sentiments. I'd be willing to go lower in reserves if that's what it needed to, get the job done isn't the right phrase, but have a more robust response in terms of what I think the extra staff that we're going to be needing for summer school, for math specialists, for reading specialists, to really address the learning loss. But I will be voting for it because it's the art of compromise. But if we get a couple months down the road and we actually see where our students are and what the response is with a 7%, I'm willing to revisit this.
All right, Constam and then Scott.
Thanks. I think I said this the last time, or the first time we addressed this question back in December, which is it does feel like the tail wagging the dog in this conversation. And, Elizabeth mentioned that it doesn't seem right to build a budget around the priority of preserving reserves. And that is what it feels like in this conversation. And I agree that's just completely wrong. However, we haven't even gotten to our budget process and we haven't even seen the superintendent's budget proposal, which is, I predict, going to be all about how we continue to further our goals of eliminating disparities, given the exacerbation of those disparities, the worsening of those disparities. And so this is taking a huge chunk out of our reserves. I agree, it's really uncomfortable to, at this point, not know what it's going to take to be able to invest in what our kids need. But this is just the beginning of that process. And it's just a question of how deeply do we want to cut into that sense of financial responsibility that we've been trying to push this district to have for a long time. And also, these decisions are not irreversible. We're going to have a whole road full of changes, both on the revenue side and on our understanding of the expenditure side. So I appreciate that staff needs this hard and fast number in order to begin building the rest of the budget proposal. But I do also feel like the whole process seems quite backwards and it's awkward.
Director Scott.
Thanks. Yeah, I'll be supporting the resolution. I would have preferred, I felt more comfortable at 8%, but 7% I think is workable. Although again, increases the risk. At the risk of Kara changing my name to Cassandra permanently, I mean, I feel like it is important to come back. And I just want to share, probably the hardest thing I've ever had to do in my career was lay off 700 employees, which I had to do in March. And I had to do that because we ran out of reserves. And I want to point out that the operations we were talking about were very well reserved. They met or exceeded GFOA's goals in all cases. And because of this pandemic, we laid off 700 people. I fully agree with PAT President Thiel's comments. I think layoffs are very disruptive. Everything we can do to preserve teachers and positions and student learning is really, really important. Massive layoffs that come from the type of catastrophic situation that governments, including school districts, sometimes find themselves in are far, far more disruptive. And so for me, I think I want to make sure we don't frame this as we spend money to increase learning and save positions, or we sit on the money. The trade-off is the lower our reserves are, the more we have to cross our fingers that nothing bad happens. And we've been doing that for a long time. We're going to continue doing that moving into the future, but there is a significant risk there that I think we just need to be honest and transparent about as we move forward. Thanks.
Okay, any further comments before we vote?
I just say one thing, and I'm gonna back up our local Cassandra here a little bit. The reason why we're having to talk so much now about establishing some minimum standards for reserve funding or reserve funds is partially because of the pandemic, but it's also because this district has a long history of failing to have sufficient reserves to deal with crises. So, I mean, I think we need to be prudent. I think we need to be flexible enough to deal with situations as they arise. But in principle, I mean, we do need to be talking about reserves, robust reserves, because stuff happens. Stuff happens every year. Some years more stuff happens. And this next year is going to be, I think, extraordinary. But we do need to, it's not, it wouldn't be so much the tail wagging the dog if we didn't have a history of having no tail. So.
All right, anything else before we vote, Nathaniel?
Yeah, I'd just like to say something. Well, I chose to abstain during our first vote of the night. I'm now beginning to slightly lean toward scenario 4. I know that's now pretty much out of the question, but I beginning to see that argument more now. But in any case, I will support I will vote in favor of this proposal because I do see its importance and its virtue even when compared to scenario 4. Yeah, that's about it. Thank you.
Yeah, Nathaniel, sometimes I'll come into a meeting thinking I know what I am going to do and how I'm going to vote, and then listening to my colleagues and the public testimony changes my mind. So I think, again, that's one of the points of why we have board meetings and why we discuss these things, that we do learn from each other as we do this process. All right, is there anything further before we call a vote on this matter? All right, the board will now vote on resolution 6222 as amended. Adopt a 21-22 budget goal for ending fund balance reserve. All in favor, please indicate by saying yes. Yes.
Yes.
Yes.
Thanks, Amy. All opposed, please indicate by saying no.
No.
Are there any abstentions? All right. Resolution 6222 passes as amended, passes by a vote. I guess I can stop saying amended because we voted on the amendment. Resolution 6222 passes by a vote of 6-1 with Student Representative Shu voting.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you all for that in-depth and excellent discussion. Is there any other business at this time before we adjourn? All right, the next regular meeting of the board will be held on January 12th, and this meeting is now adjourned.